Alright, good morning everybody, and welcome to another ePrime livestream. My name is Devon. I am the training coordinator for Psychology Software Tools, and today we have a pretty important topic to talk about when it comes to making ePrime experiments. Today's topic is going to be all about maintaining millisecond accurate timing in your experiments. Not only how to do that, but what it means, and how to know that your experiment has the best possible millisecond accurate timing. So unlike some other live streams that we've done in the past, we're not actually going to be going through and making an experiment from scratch. I try to add a component of that in every single live stream that I do, but today what we've actually done is I've actually made an experiment that has very poor millisecond accurate timing, and I want to show how to get that experiment from that state over into a state where it has excellent millisecond accurate timing. So I'm going to go ahead and start by showing you the experiment that I made beforehand that is going to have really bad millisecond accurate timing, and I'll show you exactly what I mean by that as well, because that's going to be really important to understanding the edits that we make to this experiment, not only the types of edits, but how and where exactly we're making these edits. So I'm going to go ahead and open up ePrime 3 here. So this is this simple experiment that I had made. Now what the experiment's doing, and we'll take a look at this session proc here, I just have a basic welcome screen, just says welcome to the experiment, press space to continue. Pretty basic, nothing too fancy there. Then I have a goodbye screen at the very end. And then in my block list, you can see that I'm alternating between procedures. I have one procedure here called ITI procedure and one procedure here called STIM procedure. Now what these are doing is they are actually alternating back and forth between these two procedures here, ITI proc and STIM proc. And the effect that I'm getting, since this is going to be set to sequential selection, the effect I'm getting here is that I have my ITI appear on the screen, and my ITI, if you look here, is just a blank screen. And then immediately after my ITI leaves the screen, my stimulus is going to be on the screen. And if you can see here, I have these in two separate procedure objects themselves, but that doesn't actually have any bearing on what the experiment's going to look like when it's run. All that it's going to change is just where they're located when the experiment's actually being designed. And then we'll go ahead and take a look at my stim object. I just have word stim and press 1 or 2 on the keyboard. Very basic experiment. I'm not trying to do anything overly fancy. But do know that some of the effects that I show, these timing effects, are going to be a little bit exaggerated if I do something a little more involved, like if this, instead of text display, is a movie display, or if it's an image display. Those are going to actually introduce larger onset delays as well. And we're going to talk about overcoming them too. But if you look, before my word stim, I have some inline script. I just have a debug.print statement, I have a c.setAttrib, and then I'm debug.printing the value of that attribute there. And then my post stim here is literally just some more debug print statements. So in my pre-stim here, what I'm doing is I'm just saying stim is about to run, and I'm saying that the current object time, or the current time is, and then a simple clock.read statement. And then I'm also doing a debug print statement of what the value of this attribute is here. And then as far as post stim, I'm just saying the stim object just ran, the current time is, and then I'm debug printing the current time. I have my new attribute being set right there, and then I have that value of that attribute as well. So, all very basic things, all very, very simple experiment. And then if you take a look here, I have a whole bunch in my unreferenced object section. Now, before I did the live stream, I actually did a run of this to see how millisecond accurate this actually is. Now, the reason why I'm not actually collecting this data live is because the only way that I can run this experiment while being able to stream to YouTube is by doing this, this windowed mode here. Now, windowed mode is really good for testing your experiment, but it's not great at getting millisecond accurate timing or even accurate reports of how long these objects took to run. And the reason behind that is because you would run in test mode with the clock scaled, and then ePrime would kind of guess what the timing for that particular experiment was. So it's not necessarily going to give you the best representation of how accurate it was, or how accurate, or how delayed your objects were when they were being drawn to the screen and when they were run. So I had to run this in full ePrime mode, and doing that just by clicking on run, just in the full run mode, just to make sure that the data that I was collecting was being accurate and wasn't something that ePrime had kind of calculated based on trends that it saw. So I'll show you what the kind of data that I got here. So I'm going to open up this. It's just called, it's literally just called timing issues, and it's just 1.1. Now what I'm looking for in here in terms of millisecond accuracy and to see how long these objects took to display on the screen is I'm looking at a column called .onset delay. And .onset delay is going to be associated with each and every one of my objects. So if I scroll over here, I see I have welcome .onset delay. My ITI is going to have an onset delay column, and my stem object is going to have an onset delay column. Now the reason I'm looking at the onset delay column to determine my millisecond accuracy for the experiment is because the onset delay column basically determines the difference between when the object should have appeared on the screen and when the object actually appeared on the screen. So this kind of represents a delay in the experiment, something that E' basically had to sit and wait to do all of these other processes and then be able to move on. Now I can do this and scroll back and forth through my data file all day, but that doesn't do a good job of showing me all of the onset delay values all at once. To do that, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to click on this Arrange Columns little tab here, and then I'm actually going to remove all of these columns from my data file. I don't necessarily need all of them. I don't need to know, for example, any duration errors for my ITI object. I don't need to know the device that was used to respond to the stem object because it's only a keyboard. And I'm really only just looking at the timing accuracy in my experiment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to search for all of the .onset delay entries in this column. To do that, I'm going to just make sure this little wildcard character is in this search bar, and then afterwards just type .onset delay and hit enter. Now what that does is in these arranged columns, it actually highlights all of my .onset delay values here. So I have my stem, my ITI, and my welcome. And if I go ahead and click add, it's only going to add those three to my data file, and I click OK. And then now I can see all of my all of my onset delays together. Now if we take a look here, welcome onset delay is gigantic. 400 milliseconds is a ridiculous onset delay. Now keep in mind though, if we look at our experiment structure, my welcome object is the very first object on the screen. It's going to be my instructions, the way that some people set up their labs. This welcome object's even on the screen before participants come into the lab. So it's not necessary to have perfect onset delay or even close to zero onset delay for an object like welcome, and similarly we don't necessarily need millisecond accuracy for the goodbye object, and that's why if you look at my data file here, I'm not even really logging anything in relation to my goodbye object, because in my experiment the timing critical portion of it, or the part of it that I'm really concerned is millisecond accurate, is this stem object. This is the object to which participants are responding, and it's the object that I need to show up with the best timing possible, with the least onset delay. So welcome, while it is gigantic as far as onset delay is concerned, we don't need to focus on that one as much. Goodbye, again, we don't need to focus on it as much. ITI, that becomes a little bit more of a problem if there's something like 143 millisecond onset delay. That's a quite large onset delay. I mean, that's not something that would typically be normal in an experiment, and not something that we would deem as an acceptable onset delay. And then the most worrisome is the stem column, because like I said, the stem object is the object that my participants are responding to, and that's a gigantic onset delay. There's a whole 136 milliseconds per trial, some of them are 135 per trial, or per time that the participants see that per time the participants see that stem object, that's being delayed, and those add up over time. So 136 in one trial, 136 in another, and they just stack to make your task longer and longer and longer than it should have been. So if you're running, for example, an fMRI experiment where the timing of this entire experiment needs to be a very exact duration, delays this big become very problematic. And then even if you're not doing an fMRI task, if you're just doing a normal behavioral task, these types of delays in the stem or in your timing critical object aren't acceptable either. Now the one thing that you will notice if you take a look at these data columns here, especially for some newer E' users, this looks a little disconcerting at first, are these null values. So the null values don't mean that E' wasn't collecting data on these trials. All that it means is that this particular object wasn't running at the same time as the ITI object. So if we look at my experiment again, this ITI proc is a whole procedure that ran, and when my ITI procedure was running, my stem proc wasn't running. And conversely, when stem proc was running, my ITI proc was not running because they are two separate procedures. So those null values in my data file are actually expected and not something that you have to freak out about at all. They just are there literally to say ITI was running, that means stim wasn't. Stim was running, that means ITI wasn't. And it's a function of me having them on two different procedures like this. So I'm going to also show how to kind of simplify this a little bit later too. But overall, timing, not that great. This is less than ideal timing. So now let's go ahead and work on making edits to this experiment to make the timing much better and make it something that's going to be more acceptable in an experimental environment. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the display device. We're going to actually take a look at how E' is drawing things to the screen and how quickly it's drawing to the screen before we go ahead and edit any experiment design things, because some of the changes that we're going to make are going to be pretty heavily experiment design related. So the first one is, let's go ahead and double click on the experiment object and we'll click on this devices tab. Now let's double click on this display device to see some of the properties that we have here. My match desktop resolution set to runtime is no. That's ideal. Now the one property I do want to look at specifically though is this refresh alignment property. It's currently set to 0%, which actually isn't even E' default. But if you have an older experiment that you're porting from E', let's say 1 to 2 to 3, or you're porting from an older version of E' that didn't have this property into E' 3, this may be set to 0 just to maintain that consistency in timing between experiments. E' does take a great does go through great efforts to maintain timing consistency when upgrading a task from an older version to a newer version, even if that means not setting some of the really important properties that are going to help your experiment. So let's take a look at this refresh alignment property. What this does is this actually lets E' take a look at all of the refresh rates that are happening on your computer, or all of the refreshes that are happening during your experiment, and then it says, is it more accurate to make E' or this object wait for the next screen refresh, or to hop on the previous one? Now, to explain that in a little more depth, this computer that I'm running right here is a 60 Hertz monitor, which means it updates every 16.66666666 milliseconds, 6 on repeat, milliseconds. If my if the duration of my object isn't divisible by 16.666666, or we'll say 17 for the sake of argument, if my duration isn't divisible by 17, with this refresh alignment property set to no, let's say my screen was set to refresh at the 15 millisecond mark, what it would have to do is it would have to wait until a new refresh happens. So if, for example, the refresh was set to happen, E' might have to wait an additional 15 or all the way up to 16 milliseconds in order to display the object, because E' literally just sitting there waiting for your screen to refresh. And that does add considerable onset delay. But if I change this refresh alignment to, let's say, 50% for now, what E' is going to do is it's going to say, okay, if I wait to get on the next screen refresh, I'll have to wait 15 milliseconds. But if I get on the previous screen refresh, I'll only have to wait -2 milliseconds, and the object actually appears on the screen 2 milliseconds before it was slated to, instead of 15 milliseconds afterwards. And that's actually going to be more ideal for a lot of experimental situations, because the 15 milliseconds on a per trial basis definitely adds up. -2 milliseconds means that the object appears a little sooner than it should, but it's much less of an impact than 15 milliseconds per trial would have been. So this allows E' to kind of smartly take a look at where the refreshes are, and allows it to align each of the objects appearing on the screen with the screen refresh. So I'm going to set this to 50%, and I'm going to go ahead and click OK to save that change. That's really all I want to change on this display device. Aside from that, all the properties on here look exactly the way I want them to. Let's go ahead and click Apply and OK to change that. Now, the next easiest thing for me to edit about this experiment is pretty obvious if you're pretty big on experimental design. And let's go ahead and scroll down here. It's this unreferenced eObject section. Now, the unreferenced eObject section, for those of you who don't know what it is it's kind of like E''s recycle bin, or the recycle bin on your computer, but in E'. These are the objects that aren't currently being referenced by any procedure in your experiment. That doesn't mean that they don't run or won't run in the experiment, it just means they don't currently live on a procedure. For example, if I want this text display object that's in my unreferenced eObject section to sometimes appear in my experiment, I can make an inline script that allows it to do so. But if we took a look at my inline script here, I don't have anything that's referencing any of these e-objects. They were just artifacts from when I was making my experiment. I had this big grand experiment design in mind and decided to change my mind last minute, hit delete button because that's how they get there. So like if I had the text display object next to ITI and I'm like, I don't need that one, I click delete and it actually shows up in my unreferenced e-object section down there. So these are all just objects I'm not using. It is really, really good practice to delete any unused objects from the unreferenced e-object section. So I'm not actually using any of these when I run my experiment at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete them. Now to delete them, there's a couple ways you can do that. You can actually click on one and click delete, and it'll say this action will remove all references to the object and will be destroyed forever. Would you like to proceed? A little dramatic, but definitely something that you want to do. I'm going to go ahead and click yes, and as you can see, it then removes itself from unreferenced e-objects. Now, if we have a lot of objects in our unreferenced e-object section, it's important to remove all of them. Not only because I'm not using them and they're taking up space in my Experiment Explorer, but because whenever ePrime runs, because there are ways to reference these objects while you're running an experiment, ePrime loads all of the properties of all of these objects when you are running your experiment. So it'll load all of the properties of my text display objects, and I have 6 of them. It's going to load all of my 3 slide objects. It's going to load all of this list object and this weight object and this label object. So that's a lot of time and a lot of computer resources being allocated to stuff I'm not even using. So it makes no sense for me to have it there. So instead of clicking on each one of them and clicking delete, what I can do is I can take my mouse and put it on the unreferenced e-object section right here. And I can right click on it and then click on this delete all from unreferenced e-object section. And it actually works the same way if you just hit shift and delete, it'll do the same thing. But if I do that, I get another error message that's very similar. It just says you are about to delete all e-objects from reference e-objects. All of them will be destroyed forever. Depending on the number of objects, this may take several minutes. Are you sure you want to proceed? I'm going to click yes. So now my experiment looks a little tighter, a little neater here. I don't have all of the objects in my unreferenced e-object section, and the only thing that I have here are the objects that are going to run in my experiment. So, I mean, while this doesn't have the biggest impact on timing, it will definitely have an impact on your timing, and honestly, it just looks better like this. So what I'm going to do now, since I've made a couple of changes, is I'm actually going to save this one. And I'm just going to save this as timing issues _ fixed. Just because I'm fixing the timing issues on this one. And just so I don't lose any progress. So we'll go ahead and save that. So now the next thing I want to take an active look at is I want to look at these inline objects here. Now there's a really common misconception in ePrime that inline objects are kind of free timing, that anything that you put in an inline, because it's an inline, it means it runs faster, it means it runs with more accurate timing, it means that, you know, all of these debug print statements that I have in here are going to take 0 milliseconds to run and 0 milliseconds to execute because they're inline. They're not these fancy E-objects. So all of these are just, you know, this is free timing in here and it doesn't impact anything. And honestly, you couldn't be further from the truth. These inline objects actually have a really big impact on your timing, and depending on what's in this or what's in these inline objects, they could have a gigantic impact on how long it takes for these objects to appear on the screen. Now the reason that I demonstrated the debug.print statement in a lot of these is debug.print statements, A, are a great way to troubleshoot your experiment design, and B, something that not a lot of people realize is they should only be used for troubleshooting. If I have a full experiment that I'm running and collecting active data on, it's really important to get rid of these debug.print statements. And the reason for that is each debug.print statement can take up to 13 milliseconds to run. That is a lot of time, especially if you have a lot of debug.print statements like I do. So I have 1, 2, 3. I mean, that could be up to, 39 milliseconds just to get through this inline object. And the same thing for this post stem. So I'm introducing a lot of possible onset delay into my experiment just by having these debug.print statements there. Now, like I said, they're great for design time. If you're running your experiment and you want to see how long everything is and want to make sure that it functions correctly, they are absolutely indispensable. But if you're starting to collect data, they're absolutely not needed. Now, there's a couple ways to get rid of them. The most obvious and the easiest way is to highlight them and just click delete. They'll go away. And you just saved yourself some timing error there. Another way to do that, if you want to keep them and possibly introduce them later, if you think that something's not functioning correctly, is you can actually just comment them out. E prime, when it runs these inline objects, it doesn't actually process any comments like this. It basically sees this little asterisk here, or this little apostrophe here, which denotes in E prime that everything afterwards is a comment, and if you're using script sense, it'll show up in green. But we'll see this little apostrophe here, and it'll go, okay, I'm not concerned with anything past this, and it'll move on. And that actually doesn't take any time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out these debug.print statements, because it is going to save me a lot of time in the long run. I'm going to go to my post stim, and I'm going to comment those out as well. There we go. So what this is doing then is this is actually just getting rid of these debug.print statements so I don't have those timing delays when I run my experiment. So I'm going to close all of those. It's also important to remember too that there are other things that you can do in inline script aside from debug.print statements that actually do have an impact on your timing in your experiment. One of the more important things that people tend to forget are loop objects. So if you have a for next loop, if you have a do while loop, anything like that, those actually take time to execute as well. As do these c.setAttrib statements, they take time to execute as well. And the important thing to note about these inline objects is that E prime has no way to log their timing. So I can't do or get the .onset delay of my pre-stim inline object, because the inline object is just a bit of script. It doesn't actually have its own timing properties. So I can't look to see how long my pre-stim object took to load, because it doesn't have those same properties as an E object does. So any delays that are going to appear in an inline object show up as the .onset delay of the next object. So however long this inline object took to execute is going to show up as an onset delay for my stem object. Just because E prime can't really handle the timing of an inline object, or can't handle the timing delays introduced by an inline object in the same way that it can all of its other objects, especially when you're talking about timing. So this is something that's really important to keep in mind whenever you write inline script. Like, no matter where it is in your experiment, before the object, after the object, it's just important to keep in mind. Alright, so now I'll step down off of my inline object soapbox. The next thing I want to do is I want to actively take a look at my procedures here. So if you look here at my block list, I have an ITI proc and a stim proc. All this is doing is showing my ITI proc or my ITI object and my stim object next to each other. I don't necessarily need entire new procedures for my ITI and for my stim object, especially because they're going to show up one after another sequentially anyway. There isn't anything necessarily different about it, and this is a good example of how your experiment design can greatly impact the timing of each individual object on your experiment. Each object has a property here called PreRelease, and right now it's set to 0. We'll talk about that. But the point of PreRelease is that you allow E prime to give up running this object or internally processing this object when it's on the screen to begin preloading the next object in your experimental timeline. Now, this is really great if you have a scenario like this, where you have an object that is just a blank screen. Its timing doesn't necessarily concern me because participants are not responding to this object. But what does concern me is the timing of the stim objects. I can essentially use PreRelease on my ITI object to preload my stim object before it's able to be displayed on the screen. Now for text, this might end up being negligible. Text is very quick for E prime to load. If you're doing something like images or movies though, having an object before it with plenty of PreRelease gives E prime time to buffer the movie, load the sound, load the image, and then present it with millisecond accuracy. So having an object with PreRelease before an object that's timing critical is super important. So to do that, what I'm going to have to do is actually edit the structure of my experiment just a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of that window and go back into my block list. Now, the goal here is to have this ITI object just before my stim object. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make a new procedure, and I'm going to put both of these objects on that new procedure. So I'm actually going to just delete this first row, and I'm just going to call this one testproc. And hit enter. It says testproc doesn't exist. Would you like to create it? Of course, I'm going to click yes. Now I'm going to go ahead and double click on testproc, and I'm only going to put my ITI object and my stim object there. And I'm going to take my inline objects and I'm going to put them actually just outside them. So my pre-stim happens here, my post-stim happens here. So now it looks like I have all of these things everywhere. What I want to do, since I have all of the objects in my experiment located on one procedure, is I want to remove my stim and ITI proc because they're now becoming redundant. So I'm going to double click on my block list here, and I'm actually going to take my test proc procedure, and I'm going to use this little fill handle to fill in all of these procedure items for all 18 levels of my experiment. So now, in my block list, I only have this test proc, and my ITI and stim proc have now been relocated to unreferenced E objects down here. If you take a look, my ITI, my stim, my pre-stim, and my post-stim, they're all in my experiment, even though they show up in unreferenced E objects. So if I go ahead and delete all unreferenced E objects like we talked about earlier, the only thing that it's going to remove is the ITI proc and the stim proc and their hold or their reference to these objects that are already in my experiment. It's not going to delete the objects there, it'll just delete them from the unreferenced section. So we'll go ahead and do that. Right click on unreferenced E objects and click delete all from unreferenced E objects section there. It says you're about to delete all of the E objects, are you sure you want to proceed? I'm going to go ahead and click yes, and they're all gone. Now this is perfect, because what this allows me to do then is it allows me to go into my test proc, and as you can see, my ITI object is just before my stimulus object, or my stim object. What this allows me to do is it allows me to change the pre-release on my ITI so I can start preloading that stim object and give it plenty of time to run, or plenty of time to load before it runs. So I double click on my ITI object and I click on the properties page icon here in the top left corner. I go on over to my duration input tab and I take a look at the pre-release object. Now there are instances where pre-release is less than desirable in some cases. This isn't all the time at all. And this is something that you'll kind of have to take on a trial-by-trial basis or an object-by-object basis in ePrime. But in general, pre-release here isn't going to hurt us. Nobody's responding to this device, so it's just going to be sitting on the screen acting as a little break between the stimulus responses. And then, there's no inline object after this, so it's not going to impact its function at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take pre-release here, and I'm going to click on this drop-down arrow next to it, and I'm going to set it to same as duration. If I set my object duration to same as duration, or my pre-release duration to same as duration, and click apply and OK, what ePrime is going to do whenever it runs is it's going to show my ITI on the screen, and it will remain on the screen for the entirety of its 1000 milliseconds, or 1 second. But what it's going to do in the background is it's not actually going to process the ITI. ePrime is going to immediately call its .offset and say, okay, as soon as it's on the screen, it offset, even though it stays on the screen for the whole 1000 milliseconds. And it's actually going to spend the rest of that 1000 milliseconds, so a whole 999 milliseconds, loading that stim object and all of the text on it and all of its properties, so then it has the best chance of having the best millisecond accuracy that it can. So what we're going to do too is go into stim and check its pre-release property. And if you look here, pre-release is set to 0. On the stim object, it doesn't matter as much. And it doesn't matter as much for a couple of reasons. The one reason is that the post-stim object here is an inline object. And actually, if we set this to pre-release, we're going to have an experiment advisor warning that we have an object with pre-release just before an inline object. In this case, since the inline object is literally just, if I take a look here, the stim object uses pre-release prior to an inline object or feedback display, or is the last object on a procedure, and it says goodbye does the same thing. And it's absolutely right. The module here is just called pre-release with caution, which doesn't necessarily mean that this is an error in our experiment. All that this means is that it might impact how the experiment functions, and that's something that's important for us to keep in mind, because the stim object might be going into this script too early, and this script might be processing some of the responses from stim object, and if it releases into it before it's done processing, then it might assume that you didn't respond to something that you did respond to. There's a lot of contingencies here, and that's why we warn about it in the experiment advisor. But just doing or setting pre-release before an inline object doesn't necessarily mean that anything bad is happening. So we are going to keep that pre-release value in the stim object. We are going to keep that one set to same as duration. And then we're going to go ahead and click OK. Now there's actually one more change that we want to make to the stim object, And this one is going to have to change almost on a per computer basis in your lab. And this is something that you'll kind of have to keep in mind whenever you run your experiments in your lab as well. And that's to change the duration. So if I take a look at the duration here, the duration is currently set to 5,000. What I need to know in this case is the refresh rate of my screen, or how fast my screen is refreshing. What this is going to tell me is exactly how fast E' is able to draw objects on the screen, and can then inform how long my duration is. So if I need to adjust my duration by a couple milliseconds in order for it to be divisible by my refresh rate, then that's what I need to do. Now, the reason we want the duration divisible by the refresh rate is because that's going to help us deal with that property that we set up here, this refresh alignment property. So the closer that we can get our duration to be divisible by our object's refresh rate, the more this refresh alignment property can kick in and say, okay, so I'm only going to be 5 milliseconds late showing this on the screen, but I'll be 3 milliseconds early if I hop on this previous screen refresh. I'm going to hop on the previous screen refresh. That was a bit of an extreme example with a ridiculously high refresh rate monitor. Obviously that doesn't reflect mine because it's going to be 16 milliseconds refresh rate. So what I'm going to do though is I'm actually going to change my property to be divisible, or my duration property to be divisible by my refresh rate. And in this case that means cutting 1,000 milliseconds off, because I don't feel like doing all of the math to figure out what the closest the closest number to that's divisible by 16 to 5,000. I just know that this one is. So I'm going to change it to this, but I do recommend doing that math on your end to make sure that your duration is divisible by your refresh rate, so E' isn't stuck waiting for the refresh rate on your computer. So that's really all of the changes that I want to make to my duration tab here. It's just a very simple change, and as long as I set that pre-release, and as long as I made sure my duration is divisible by my refresh rate, which if you look actually, if you go to Tools and then Options, and then if you go to your Experiment Advisor tab, which, it's actually an experiment. There you go, the Experiment Advisor tab here, there's actually something that E' actively looks for, and it makes sure that your duration of each object is in fact divisible by your refresh rate. That's one of the things that we actively look for in this, and it's only determined at runtime. So that's why whenever I click Generate and looked in this advisor tab down here, that's why you didn't see that, because there are some things that E' can figure out, or some things that the Experiment Advisor and E' can figure out whenever you click Generate that it can't when you're running the experiment, and vice versa. There's some things that it can figure out while it's running that it can't necessarily figure out while eStudio is just open. And one of those things is your computer's refresh rate. It can't actually figure that out while I'm not even running the experiment. But once I click Run, E' is going to say, okay, this is the refresh rate for your experiment, and let's check each of the durations to make sure they're divisible. So that's why some of these columns here say eRun yes and eStudio no. Just because here it's this one, duration not divisible by refresh rate, because E' can't figure out your refresh rate while it's just sitting here. So a good check as well for timing accuracy is just see what that Experiment Advisor says, because it's going to give you a lot of really good information about how to improve your experiment to get better millisecond accurate timing. Now the other property that I want to check out actually used to be one of our defaults in older versions or newer versions of ePrime2, so a new version of an old software. I'm going to go ahead and close all these windows to show you this. I'm going to go ahead and double click on Test Proc, and then click on this Properties page icon, and then click on this Common tab here. Now the one that I'm particularly concerned with right now is called GenerateRun. Now what GenerateRun does is it allows E' to load the entirety of the procedure during a non-timing critical portion of the task. Now what that means is the timing critical portion of this task is of course this stim object. That's what we've been talking about the whole time. This is what I'm most concerned with getting the best millisecond accuracy for. What I would consider a non-timing critical portion of this procedural timeline is the very beginning of it. So before all of this runs, I don't care if there's a little bit of a delay between when the experiment runs, or when this procedure starts, and when the ITI shows up. While I do want the ITI's onset delay to remain pretty low, the stim object's really what I care about, so I'm okay with taking some of the onset delay that's going to happen throughout the entirety of my experiment and shifting it over to just before the first object. or just before the object or the just before the procedure runs. So what generate prerun does is it allows ePrime to preload the entirety of the procedure, excluding inline objects, and we'll talk about that in a second. It allows you to preload the entirety of the e-objects on your experimental timeline before they even run. So if you're looking at the timeline, it essentially preloads all of the objects right there, right at that little green circle before everything else runs. So that way, any onset delay that happens in your experiment is going to happen before the first object and not before all of the subsequent ones. This one's a bit of a simplistic example where the onset delay is going to be shifted from being split between ITI and STEM to just being all in ITI. But this is really helpful too if you have many more objects. If I had a STEM object and if I had a probe object and all of those other types of objects, it's actually going to shift all of their onset delays to just before ITI. So ITI will become a little loaded with that onset delay, but that means that everything else in that procedure is going to run with awesome millisecond accurate timing. So I'm going to click on this generate prerun property and I'm going to change it to top of procedure, because before object run means that the onset delays happen before the object runs, because that's when ePrime decides to load the object. Changing this generate prerun property to top of procedure lets ePrime load all of the objects before the procedure runs, and that's where the onset delays are going to happen. So I'm going to click apply and OK to save this change. Now the one thing that I did want to show, and the reason why these pre-stim and post-stim objects have these set trip properties, is because this is the one piece of inline script that this generate prerun property affects. Now if you set up your experiment like this and set generate prerun to top of procedure, I'd mentioned that it preloads all of the e-objects in your experiment except for inline objects. Inline objects, the way that they function is they literally will just sit on your procedural timeline and they will insert the line of script that you have into the line of full script whenever the full script encounters them. If ePrime is preloading all of the e-objects, it's essentially doing this, taking all of your e-objects and moving them and loading them at this part of the procedure, and it's ensuring that all of the other objects come afterwards. And that's really easy. I can actually just get that back, no problem. So we'll just go ahead and open that up. So what that's doing essentially with that generate prerun is it's just ensuring that all of the objects appear, or that all of the objects are being loaded before the inline objects happen. Now the reason that that affects those those c.setAttrib statements, there we go, see, right back to where we were. The reason that that affects those c.setAttrib statements is because ePrime is trying to actively insert those into script exactly when they happen. Now, the impact of that is if my STEM object was referencing, for example, this new attribute that I had made, I'm going to get an error message once I have this generate prerun property set to top of procedure like this, because it's going to say, hey, that object doesn't exist. Or that object, or that attribute, sorry. It's going to say that attribute doesn't exist, even though I'm loading it technically in what it looks like before the STEM object even appears on the screen. But because I'm loading the objects in front of it, it actually works out that the object appears on the screen before I'm loading the inline script. So it is important to keep in mind what types of attributes you're referencing and how you're referencing them when you have that generate prerun property set to top of procedure like this. So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm actually just going to comment out these c.setAttrib statements for now. And the reason I'm going to comment them out for now is because they're not being referenced in my ITI or my STEM. There's something that's actually just going to be used for data analysis later. So I don't necessarily need them to be millisecond accurate. I don't need them to be loaded at any part of my experiment. And honestly, I can have them in and they won't affect my timing that much. But just for the sake of this run, I am just going to comment them out. But that is basically the big caveat that you need to keep in mind whenever you set that generate prerun property to top of procedure, is that it is going to impact the place at which these attributes get loaded and then how they're able to be referenced in your experiment later. Generally speaking, just as a rule of thumb, if you have that c.setAttrib statement in an inline object, don't set your procedure to generate prerun, or your procedure to generate prerun property to top of procedure. Keep it a before object run, and talk to tech support will help you deal with the millisecond timing, or help you deal with any onset delays because of it. But if you can get rid of the c.setAttrib statements and the c.getAttrib statements, and your objects aren't necessarily, or don't have any references to those attributes, then this is going to be a really great property because it's going to basically front load all of that onset delay. Alright, so now that I've made all those fixes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the experiment one more time. So I'm just going to run this in windowed mode very quickly just to show you guys. I'm going to run it at 4 times its normal speed, and I'm going to make sure that I run all of the objects in my experiment. Since these are all commented out, I'm going to actually not even run them. Yeah, I'll run them. Why not? I'm going to go ahead and click test. So just to show you what the experiment looks like when it runs. I'll set data log, or I'll set my data log number 3. Just know that the data isn't necessarily going to be good because I'm running in windowed mode at 4 times the normal speed. ePrime is going to kind of simulate the timing. But I do have a data from the fixed version to show, or data file from the fixed version to show you. So there's my word stim, there's my ITI. As you can see, it's running at 4 times normal speed, so they all appear very quickly. And then after 18 trials, my experiment is going to end with the goodbye slide. And we can take a look, just for now, at what the run simulated. Like I said, it's not necessarily something that you want to, kind of go by. So it looks like my onset delays for these were about 15 milliseconds. Looks like it was off by about one screen refresh, which honestly is about expected when you're running things in windowed mode in eRun test. If you run in full mode in the regular version of this experiment, which I did before the live stream just to make sure I had this, it's just called timing issues fixed. I'm just going to do the same type of data analysis or the same type of look that I had done before. So I'm going to go into my arrange columns. I'm going to remove all, and I'm going to type .onset delay. I'm going to hit enter here. So I go ahead and add my onset or my objects with onset delay, and then this is more what I was expecting. So my welcome onset delay is going to be understandably a little large. It's the first object in the experiment, but it's not millisecond accurate. What you're going to see now is that the ITI onset delay is going to end up being much larger than the stim onset delay. Now I had mentioned that my stim onset delay is the one that's most important to me. And if we remember back to the first data file, this is a drastic difference. It was 136 milliseconds onset delay, and with these few simple changes that took honestly less than the hour that's allocated for this YouTube live stream, I got the onset delay down from 136 milliseconds to just 2 milliseconds, which is phenomenal. This is very good timing in ePrime. A couple of these trials are even 1 millisecond long. That is absolutely the ideal. So that's what we're looking for. Now the reason that our ITI onset delay is a little bit higher than our stim onset delay right now is because I have that generate pre-run property set to top of procedure, so it's taking all of those onset delays and it's pushing them onto the ITI object. This is completely expected, but since the stim object is our timing critical portion of the task, this is completely acceptable. And I actually knew that this was going to happen. But even with those changes too, if I look at my original data set here, whoops, that is not a word. There we go, .onset delay. If I look at my ITI .onset delay, I've even cut those delays in half. So even with those changes, I've now gone from 143 milliseconds of onset delay to roughly 70 milliseconds of onset delay, about 75 for most trials there. So even though I am kind of front-loading all of those onset delays onto my ITI object, they're still almost cut in half, considering what they used to be before. So these are kind of the steps that you would take in order to improve the millisecond accuracy of your timing. A lot of them have to do with the actual properties in ePrime, so some properties that you may or may not have known about. A big factor in it is your experiment design. So can you get experiments to use pre-release on, the timing critical object in your task? Can you reduce some of those pieces of inline script, so those debug.print statements, or can you at least account for them? I know I didn't mention this before, but one of the most common things that I'll see users do is they'll have something called a sleep statement. Oops, I cannot type today. There we go, they'll have a sleep statement here. And what this sleep statement is it literally just tells ePrime, hey, pause for this time, or pause for this amount of time. And ePrime, if it pauses for this amount of time, just says, okay, I'm stopping, and it'll add that 100 milliseconds onto the onset delay of your next object. And I mean, that's totally expected. That doesn't mean that any of the objects were functioning incorrectly or were functioning with poor millisecond accuracy. It just means that, you know, E prime doesn't know what to do with this extra 100 milliseconds that you told it to rest. It's technically a delay, so it's going to add it to that onset delay. So that's also something to keep in mind with your inline script. So those are the very simple steps to reducing onset delay in your experiment. If you have an experiment that you'd like for us to take a look at to help reduce your onset delay, feel free to shoot us an email with your experiment. You can do that by going to support.pstnet.com. That's our product, service, and support site, and that's the best way to get a hold of us. If you just click on the sign in button in the top right hand corner, sign in using your registered email address and password, or register and make in registered email address and password, and just click on submit a ticket. We'd be happy to take a look at your experiment, recommend edits similar to this, and recommend edits that are going to work for your experiment. Just let us know what the time and critical parts of your task are, and we're always happy to help with things like this. But just generally speaking, everything we went over today are just good guidelines. I mean, whenever I get a support ticket that says, hey, my experiment is delayed, or I have all these delays in my experiment, these are the first steps that I take to reducing those onset delays. And in the majority of cases, they're the only steps I take because these are enough to fix all of the problems. So these are really good things to keep in mind when you're making your experiments as well. So, as always, if you have any recommendations for future YouTube live streams, please feel free to submit in either an email or comment on this video. I'm always happy to, kind of edit these trainings or kind of, work in a paradigm that you guys might want or anything like that, because I do want to do what you guys are interested in too. And it's always helpful for me to know kind of what the current trends in U prime and even in psychology are too. And as always, feel free to like and subscribe to our page. It definitely allows us to keep doing what we're doing, and we honestly appreciate all the feedback. So, thank you guys very much for attending today, and have a great day.